What I think is important to point out from your research and what we just saw is that it is possible to impact Black economic mobility in less than a generation if we get the solutions right. The other point is that just to focus on place, that place always has, and it does matter. And so as we talk about that, it's important that we have this opportunity to talk with individuals who are implementing strategies and policies that ultimately are impacting Black economic mobility, which leads me right to Sherri. Raj, you left off with Charlotte as a focal point. And what we see in Charlotte is just like, it's beautiful to see the cross-sector investments that ultimately are impacting Black economic mobility in the city, which was at the last. So I'd love for you to talk about what has that arc been from looking at data to looking at activity and then looking at impact. What does that arc look like, and what has been the transformative partnerships that you all have utilized in Charlotte in particular to drive that impact?
First, I want to start by saying thanks for having me. And I think Raj picked the right city's ego to bruise, quite honestly. Charlotte is we were dead last on his 2014 study, and Charlotte is a community that is very image conscious. And if you've been to Charlotte, it's a very beautiful city. So we put a lot of effort into presenting the best that we have to offer. And so when we were ranked dead last, folks called it a wake-up call across the city. It was a wake-up call to those who weren't living in those conditions. For folks who were living in those conditions or working to support in human service and support efforts, it was finally the attention that folks had been waiting for. In either case, it was an opportunity for Charlotte to come together with real bold urgency and action to make things better. And so what we did initially after hearing about the study was a public-private partnership formed, which is the bread and butter of Charlotte. And so I lead that organization that serves as a coalition between the for-profit community, government, nonprofit, and our faith-based community, which is very important in the Bible Belt where we are, to come together with collective solutions, and most importantly to me, a shared commitment to that. And so having all those folks around the table, we developed a report. And what we're really proud of is that we've moved past a report around what we'll do over the course of the next 30 years to begin putting that to action with data. So economic mobility came out as new language. Before it was the American dream, and still a lot of us didn't know how to define it. So we started the work by developing our own shared measure of progress, which was really hard because we had to move the community away from being hyper fixated on this 50 out of 50 number to identifying what success looked like locally for us. And so now in what we call our opportunity compass, we're able to say across all the determinants of economic mobility as Charlotte has defined them, which are no surprise, jobs, education, family and child stability, which are things like housing, transportation, access to grocery stores. How are we trending on each of those areas in terms of leading indicators of progress, such that when Chetty releases another study like he is in just a few weeks here, we're able to have some insights onto where we're going and then action we can take along the way.
You made such an important point, and as we think about like what is done in Charlotte and impacting economic mobility, as Raj pointed out, social capital matters. And so if you're in a city like Baltimore, Detroit, DC, I thought I was going to get some hoots for that. We know that social capital plays a key role in facilitating that mobility, but with communities actually segregated, right? And continuing to be segregated, both in terms of race and economic status. I'd love to start with you, Kim, to talk about what solutions can we think about to the barrier to building social capital for Black America with those circumstances.
Sure, and let me also say I'm delighted to be here and speaking about the work of my colleagues at the Urban Institute. Just one correction though, I teach at Harvard Medical School, but I do not have an MD, so I wanted to clarify that. So I think that this work is so important that Raj has shared with us and shared with the nation and the world. You know, I think the first thing that I would say is that over the long term, what we really need is multi-sectoral investments in low opportunity neighborhoods. We need the kind of investments that provide those neighborhoods with the things that we all want in our own neighborhoods: recreational spaces, gardens, opportunities for people to come together. And then we really need to create the kind of policy architecture that begins to remove the barriers for people so that they can move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. And in the short term, I think there's a lot that employers can do to drive opportunities forward. The first thing, obviously, is to have fair wages, to have opportunities for people to gain promotions in the course of their work, and also to use just the architecture of normal everyday work to ensure that there is engagement and exchange across economic levels on things like teams and work projects. So I think that thinking about in the long term what we can do on policy and the short term what employers can do is really crucial. And at the Urban Institute, we host a platform called WorkRise, where we look at solutions for the labor market. And there are a couple of best practices that the researchers who are funded through WorkRise have identified for all of us. The first is what employers can do is conduct regular audits to make sure that bias that we know is pervasive is addressed and can be mitigated through looking at promotions patterns, to looking at how wages are described, and to correct for system bias. The other thing that we can do is think more carefully about skills-based hiring and evaluation criteria, and really ask questions about whether a college degree is truly necessary for some jobs. That opens up opportunities for others. And then when we look at hourly wage workers, it's so critical to think about how scheduling, regular scheduling, stability and control of your own time makes a difference. And when we also think about the role of apprenticeships and making sure that apprenticeships are also open to communities of color, particularly to African American women and women of color, this too can bolster economic mobility.
That's great. And I'd love to have Sherri and Raj also opine on this question of how do we mitigate the segregation of communities as we talk about.
Yeah, I'm happy to add. I mean, I agree with all of that. And I think basically taking a deliberate approach to forming social capital, I think about it in two dimensions. One is exposure, so reducing segregation. You can't be friends with people you never meet. So having schools that are more integrated, having neighborhoods that are more integrated, thinking about what zoning laws, multifamily zoning, affordable housing, various policies that are intended to address some of these issues, but sometimes are not as effective as they could be. I think that's one important dimension. But what we find in the Facebook data is that there's another equally important dimension that we call friending bias. Even conditional on being in the same room, people of different racial backgrounds, people of different income backgrounds tend to interact much less than people with common backgrounds. And so addressing that friending bias, thinking about why within what appear to be diverse schools, we still have a lot of segregation within those school walls. Can we develop programs that bring kids together, perhaps through sports, perhaps through other activities? I think that can also have a very big effect. So I think basically not treating it as something that just happens, but something that we can address intentionally in each circumstance would be very valuable.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would add to that, in addition to programs, there can be policies within school districts, because I think we do see it most powerfully happening in schools. And if you've ever lived through redistricting, it's brutal. And so thinking through redistricting, but also things like magnet programs. So Dr. Chetty and his team lifted up the Northwest School of the Arts in Charlotte, and where we see the most or the highest levels of economic connectedness is there. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor or black or white, it's about, can you play the saxophone? And we provide transportation for those students to get there. And so it creates, increases their level of exposure to one another around a shared purpose. What I've really been trying to communicate to our folks who sit in powerful seats is that mentorship is nice, but it's not the answer. And it's also really difficult to do that in really great trauma-informed ways that we often skip over as a part of that. And so thinking about how we can bring children together. And then another one that we're exploring in Charlotte, because we are so heavily faith-based, is the role of churches, especially in economic connectedness in same race, because I want to be clear that it's not always about having a poor black child with a rich white person, which is I think what we often go to. But I know in my own personal experience growing up in Detroit, my family was one generation out of poverty. So we worked on the line, but I went to church with black folks who were executives at Ford and GM and saw a different possibility for myself because of that. So it's exploring opportunities for that connection, both inside of our, I guess, government institutions, but also how we're spending our time.
No, and just to build upon just what you said, Sherri, about the role of overt racism on social capital and the limitations of that as we think about social capital. Raj, I'd love to point to you and ask the question of, as we think at a systems level, of how do we impact overt racism and its impact upon Black economic mobility? What are your thoughts on solutions around that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's very important to think about as well. Let me just touch upon one thing that Sherri said, which I want to underscore, and we see in the data. You mentioned the role of faith-based institutions. Very interestingly, if you look at the Facebook data and look at where people are most likely to make cross-class friendships, to interact with somebody very different from them, it's precisely in faith-based institutions or religious institutions. If you look at in their employers or in their neighborhoods, there's a lot more stratification. One logic is that if you have something in common with someone, it brings people together, and that may be a vehicle to address some of these issues. Now, as you're pointing out, I think that can be part of the solution, but one also needs to address, it's not the only thing for sure. And so issues of racism, discrimination in the labor market, there's been some recent work, you mentioned audits, recent study by researchers at Berkeley, where they audited large companies and assessed the extent to which they responded to resumes that were sent from Black versus white workers, and showed that at many big companies, there were significantly lower callback rates for Black Americans than white Americans. But what they showed, which was interesting in that study and may point towards a solution, is that the companies that exhibited the least discriminatory practices tended to have more centralized hiring systems, where it wasn't just sort of up to someone to make a decision based on who they were connected to or how they felt about a candidate, but there was kind of a systematized practice. This is how we do things. This is what we're looking for. There are multiple people involved in the decision. That's one example of the type of thing that I think we can identify, try to monitor, and do systematically. Again, I don't think there's one silver bullet here, but multiple steps like that, I think, can make a difference.
One thing I'd love to, I think as you think about, it's not just the or, it's the genius of the and of what we can think about in terms of impacting this. I'd love to point to Kim and have you focus on those community-centered strategies that ultimately impact Black economic mobility. And in your research with urban, what are the things that you've seen that have worked and been a part of solutions in communities?
Right. Well, I think that community engagement is a critical part of whether you're redesigning organizational structures, as you were just talking about, or whether you're trying to understand the impact of the policies as they're implemented in communities. And so at the Urban Institute, we have a center on community engaged methods. And it really consists of a platform for not only tools and approaches to community engagement, but also to training and direct engagement with communities so that they can have full public participation in all parts of the research process. From the very beginning, when studies are being designed, to when data is being collected, to when the data is being used in terms of interventions. And I think it's so crucial to notice that public participation and community engagement is also at the heart of what the Biden administration has done with their equity action plans. Mandated community engagement is required of all federal agencies at the present time. And in cities and municipalities across the country, their equity initiatives also typically have some form of community engagement. And the most important and impressive types of community engagement are this. They begin with the premise that community residents, people who live in the area, are experts. Not just generic experts, but experts on the fractures in the community, what's working in the community, and they're also sources of genuine innovation. But in order for that innovation to be tapped, you have to design public processes that actually work. You can't have a meeting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Thursday and expect you're going to get everybody that you'd like to talk with. Another aspect of community engaged methods is really prioritizing power sharing, actually making sure that the community has a stake and the ability to make collaborative decisions. So you asked for an example. In Kings County, Washington, the Communities of Opportunity is a unique public-private partnership for place-based work. And by guaranteeing majority representation on the initiative's governance board to community members, and by allocating resources to organizations that prioritize advancing racial equity, they've ensured that power is actually distributed across the organization and across the communities with which they're working. So if we look for a couple of principles that might guide us, here are a couple. One is that equity has to be a goal and one that's embedded in real practices. And that's certainly the theory that's in the federal action plans. When we make equity an explicit goal, we can look at how policies are implemented, not just the policies themselves, and how that can drive change. And the second principle would be making sure that we're shifting power, taking some risk by working differently with communities and building trust. That's what it really means to share power. The third would be to make sure that we're bridging communities and initiatives and sectors. Policy windows for equity open and close. That's been the case throughout history in the US. George Floyd's murder opened up a policy window, and we've seen a lot of innovation, as Andre was mentioning earlier. But until we get together and really make sure that we're learning from what those experiments have yielded, what worked, what hasn't, we're not going to get the full benefit of that. And then finally, it's important to commit for the long haul. Often when researchers or even others come into a community, we parachute in and then we leave. But that's not the trajectory of life in the community. So staying in the community, in conversation, enables the possibility of genuine structural change.
No, I appreciate that, Kim. And as I want to pivot us to a discussion, because we've talked about place. And often when we have discussions primarily about place, it sometimes cannot lead to Black inclusion, but rather Black exclusion, where we see a displacement in communities. So how do you think about building vibrant, inclusive, connected Black communities while mitigating displacement at the same time? I'd love to start with you, Sherri, and then Raj and Kim.
Mm-hmm. Charlotte is a blue community in a very red state, Dillon Rule state. So it's difficult for us to implement policy that includes language or practice around equity. But we can build equitable communities. And so what or work to do that. So what our city council did and mayor, we have a city manager system, is we developed a comprehensive 2040 plan, and it's committing to equitable growth for the next several years. And the main piece in this, because I know we talked a lot about home ownership, is transforming neighborhoods that had previously been single-family zoned homes or places only into duplexes, triplexes, and townhomes, such that individuals, and specifically Black folks living in Charlotte, who make up a lot of those who are living in poverty, can own homes in areas that also have strong and stable schools, that have grocery stores, that are able to walk to parks. And as a byproduct of that, the social capital is increased. And so that is one of the kind of local attempts that we're taking to institutionalize work around equity. Now, it is, I think now we're feeling that it's almost death by 1,000 cuts, sure, because we passed that. But now as we get into the UDO and look closer, we're starting to strip away. But I think that's what we're doing locally to begin to deepen our commitment to that work.
Thank you. Raj?
So I think part of the solution can absolutely be innovative policy change, like multifamily zoning along the line of what Sherri just described. I also think that there are ways that we can spend the money that we're already spending much more effectively, attempting to address a number of these problems. So let me give you an example. We spend about $45 billion a year in the US on affordable housing programs that are intended, at least in part, to address precisely the problem you brought up of people getting excluded from neighborhoods of opportunity. But in my view, that $45 billion of expenditure is not actually achieving the intended goal of giving families access to opportunity. Because if you look at where families receiving housing vouchers or families living in affordable housing are actually living, and you overlay that data on the maps that our team has put out, you will find that they're concentrated in the red-colored neighborhoods in those cities, in the lower opportunity areas, despite the fact that they're getting $1,500 a month of rental assistance from the government. And so Why is that? Our team has actually done some work on that recently. We've done an experiment with the King County Housing Authority going back to Seattle, where we tried to figure out why families were not moving to higher opportunity places, even despite getting assistance from the government. And we ran a randomized trial, basically implementing what I would think of as a social capital intervention, connecting people with some support to help them to move to a higher opportunity area if they wanted to do so. So think of this as like a housing broker or a counselor who helps you in the housing search process, connects you to a landlord, helps you negotiate, helps you find listings that might work for you given where your job is and things like that. Basically, the kind of support any of us would benefit from if we're looking for housing in a very different place. And it turns out that that relatively low-cost intervention, it's about a 2% incremental cost on the cost of the voucher, increases the fraction of families who move to high opportunity areas to 60% in the treatment group from 15% in the control group. So it fundamentally helps start to desegregate the city, just deploying the resources we're already spending more effectively. So I think a lot of the debate is about, do we need to do new things? Do we need to spend more money and so on? Certainly that can be helpful, but my view is that there are many places where using data and careful scientific work, we can deploy the resources we're already spending more effectively. And in many instances, we're finding it comes back to these sorts of connections and social capital and making use of those resources more effectively.
No, I appreciate that.
Yeah, you know, I think what we need is also a collective commitment to making sure that we are thinking thoughtfully and comprehensively. You know, when at the Urban Institute, when we focus on place-based strategies, which we do a lot, we also try to think hard about displacement. And so we focused on strategies like rent control, public housing revitalization, and eviction prevention that preserve affordable housing. But if we ask ourselves, with every bit of work that we're doing, how can we make sure that we're preserving access to affordable housing? We're probably going to come up with more solutions than if we think of this in just a siloed way. So, for instance, just one final thing, you know, we can think about the role of the private sector in preventing displacement. In 2019, my colleague Sarah Rosen-Mortel, the president of the Urban Institute, emphasized the need for both local government and private developers to think about the kinds of regulations that will result in housing that's available at more moderate price levels. So I think part of it is a commitment, and part of it is just keeping an issue of affordable housing in particular right in front of our eyes.
Oh, thank you, thank you. And as we think about like on the ground, right, Sherri, leading on opportunity and the work that you're doing, as we talk about the solutions here, it'd be helpful for those of us who are in the private, philanthropic, in government, to think about how we, and I think if Andre were here, we'd say capital. I think he's in the audience. Capital would be what you need. But how can we support that ecosystem that is helping to build vibrant Black communities on the ground?
I'll be honest, my mind is still stuck on what Raj said. I would have really liked one of those navigators when I was trying to buy a when I think about what's happening in Charlotte and where Leading on Opportunity sits, we say we are community informed, although we spend most of our time working at the grass tops. So with the CEOs or the market presidents or whomever in Charlotte, and with those large nonprofit and government institution heads. And one of the more innovative things that we've seen happen in Charlotte, in addition to funding, right? I think we're shouting out Andre a lot, continue to give the money, right? And in addition to the funding is a CEO roundtable was formed called the Charlotte Executive Leadership Council. And it brings together the foremost CEOs in Charlotte. So you have the Bank of America's, Ally, Duke Energy, all around the table. And they came together after what we call in Charlotte the Chetty study, and put Raj put us to work, which has been great. It has been great. A CEO roundtable came together, and initially they were focused on getting non-traditional employees to work, or non-traditional workers to work. And it's expanded now to workforce development and education. So they come together quarterly to hear, convene, and act on what they can do from that corporate perspective. And from that listening and bringing in more community voice, in addition to the funding and focusing on jobs, they've now increased their strategies to include getting more Black folks into the C-suite level, so specifically focus on that, and each of those organizations has made a commitment to that. And then in terms of skills-based support, we have what we call the Leader on Loan program in Charlotte. So where executives who have experience in finance or operations plug into our public school system. Mm-hmm. So we've had several turnovers of a superintendent, and the superintendent is to be the instructional leader, head, and political figure of the organization. And they have strong instructional support in teachers, but in the middle, we're often missing the strong skill sets where the corporate community does that with ease. Yes. And so in addition to providing funding to these initiatives, we're also seeing those organizations plug in that skills-based support to help stabilize the district to get them to a place where they can function on its own. And so we're doing all the things. Yeah. We really are in Charlotte. And so, I think we're beginning to understand in Charlotte that there is no silver bullet solution. Where we struggle is that there is no quick fix, right? Folks want it to change tomorrow. Maybe folks like in this room, they're always like, Sherri, what's the data quarter over quarter? And I'm like, kids graduate once a year, like at most once a year, right? And that's like the more faster data, more so we should be looking at 3 to 5 years out. And so where we are in Charlotte is we're doing all the things and we need to maintain that long commitment to the work. And so that's where we're trying to focus now.
No, I thank you for that. And we are making progress, mm-hmm. right? And so as we wrap on this panel, I'd love to leave us on a moment of hope as we lead into even further discussions today about solutions. I'd like for each of you to just give, one reason that why we can be hopeful around Black economic mobility as we just ground ourselves and continue this discussion today. So Kim, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, what brings me hope, and also my colleagues at the Urban Institute, is really the enthusiasm that Raj's work has generated across sectors. And I think there are a lot of constituencies that are really rooting for the kind of affirmative change that we've heard is possible, and beginning to think about the social connectedness and the importance of those relational equities as well. At Urban, we hosted the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty in 2017, and Raj, you were an important part of that venture. In 2022, we updated our own upward mobility framework, and just last month, we announced that 26 new localities had joined our Mobility Action Learning Network. So that's 26 new opportunities for people to learn and carry this work forward. We've also recently launched a student upward mobility initiative to really press on what the education sector can do to enhance upward mobility for students going forward. And then finally, what gives me hope are the researchers and colleagues that are coming up behind me, who are just starting new programs of research that I think are going to be really important. And I want to give an early shout out to Urban's Black Family Thriving Initiative, which is led by Dr. Leslie Ford. So it's work that she's just started, but look for that research stream which centers on Black capabilities going forward.
Thank you.
I do want to start a little bit of a grounding, since I know everyone saw this. On Monday, we had a shooting in Charlotte where several officers were killed. And for me, it was kind of a wake-up call of, yes, we have made progress. And I think our community is really excited about the new study that's coming out. But there are many of us who are still living in hopeless, situations without what we need, and doing some, very irresponsible things that lead to hardship for those around us. And as much as I know progress is possible on the long term, for folks, when the study came out 10 years ago, their lives don't look much different now. And so I have to be honest that I'm nervous about what the study will mean in Charlotte. For, I think, some sitting in the corporate community, they're literally doing the Cabbage Patch, like we've made it, we've arrived, we've done it. And then for those who, sit in nonprofit spaces or sit in poverty, it's like, well, really, has any progress happened? And so in moments like that, I have to get really micro around like what's happened for me or those around me. Like I said, I'm from Detroit, I'm Black, which means my people are from the South, right? They came as a part of the Great Migration looking for economic mobility without that language. And 3 generations later, they now can say they have a granddaughter who went to an Ivy League institution and gets to sit in spaces like this. And so we moved to Charlotte with the same hope, right? Detroit had been really good to us, but Detroit also had lots of violence and drug abuse, which in particular hit home in my family. And so we moved to Charlotte, and when I think about the hope and possibility of Charlotte and what I now want for my 3-year-old daughter, I know that while I might not see it in my lifetime, it's possible for her. And so that's the fire that kind of keeps me going.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Well, Kim and Sherri, I would say the first thing that gives me hope is just hearing all of you talk about the various initiatives that you're undertaking, the tremendous progress that I think has been made in Charlotte, at least in trying to tackle these problems, if not seeing them bear fruit already. I would come back to the data and kind of the title of the presentation that I gave today on changing opportunity. I came into this work not sure, honestly, whether even over the timescales that I think you view as long correctly on the ground, that it's going to take decades. Even on that horizon, is it feasible to change? When you look at those maps that I started out with of patterns of slavery and other things, are we talking about a 100-year time scale here? And I come away from these data feeling like change is actually possible. A lot more remains to be done, but I think we're starting to see early signs of some positive progress in certain corners at least, and I think we can build on that and expand that opportunity much more greatly. And I will emphasize in doing that, what especially gives me hope is there are lots of folks like in this room who care deeply about these issues, but I would say opportunity is a topic that can bridge the political divide and bring people together in a way that other topics might not. And so I'm optimistic that there can be more momentum to change opportunity going forward.
Thank you. I'm going to get in on the hope conversation. I am hopeful because we are in this room with people who could be anywhere doing anything, but are focused on solutions around Black economic mobility. And I thank you all for joining in this discussion today.